Episode number 70 of the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. My guest today is Mary Goyer. Mary is a holistic fertility, pregnancy, and birth specialist, and she draws upon her traditional training in marriage and family therapy and her specialty in holistic mind-body techniques to offer a new way of approaching fertility and birth. Mary supports women who are dealing with a range of challenges: hormonal imbalances, pregnancy loss, relationship difficulties, sexual traumas, birth traumas, postpartum depression, anxiety, to name a few. Welcome to the podcast, Mary.
Hi, thank you. Glad to be here.
So can you share with us your background and how you began specializing in holistic fertility and reproductive health?
Sure. Yeah. There's two things. It really started on a personal level for me. So I was kind of one of those, maybe, maybe you can relate, or maybe people listening can relate, as one of those sort of type A, floating head graduate students. I like to say, I wasn't really aware of what was going on from the neck down. For the first whole part of my life, I was studying to be a marriage and family therapist, and just really kind of a heady, thoughtful, analytical person. And while I was studying for my master's, I was diagnosed with cervical cancer. And mind you, I had a completely Western orientation at the time. But the night before I was sitting in my doctor's office hearing this news, this was sort of like the thing that happened for me. That was my little, my mini awakening. I had maybe 5 super intense nightmares in a row the night before. And they were all about sexuality and religious programming and being.
You dreamt, you had these nightmares before finding out?
Yes, the night before.
Wow.
So it was just it was just on my mind, because it was all this stuff about, my religious upbringing, about being unsafe as a woman in this culture, body hate, just stuff like that. And it was all stuff that I would not have said was a big issue for me. It wasn't like, oh yeah, this is what we're studying in school, or, oh yeah, this is stuff I'm really aware of being alive in me. But I was super interested in dream analysis at the time. So when I had all these nightmares, I didn't dismiss it. And as I'm driving home from my appointment, kind of just thinking about this surgical procedure that I had in front of me and so on, I had this sort of light bulb moment. All this stuff was clearly running through my body, and I somehow just sort of really understood in my own way the body-mind connection in that moment, that in some subtle way, what was essentially all about femininity was now showing up in my cervix. And so I didn't have any tools at the time. There's kind of a longer story in here, but I was able to heal myself holistically. I did not end up needing the surgery, and a biopsy and all future tests showed up negative, which I had no idea at the time was even possible. Yeah.
Yeah.
But this all really led me on a path to understand what is possible when you start looking at the emotional pieces to every physical symptom. And so that was really the beginning of oh my gosh, what is this, this territory of, that I now kind of call the holistic territory. And it was maybe, couple of years later that I started to work with clients who began kind of organically bringing me their fertility challenges. And the very first one I can remember, we had been working on something else altogether. And in fact, it was related to anger and cold sores that were showing up, and so forth, that suddenly no medicine would work on. And anyways, she's like, I keep having this thought in my head that I should ask you about fertility, because, my husband and I have been actually trying to have a baby for a while, blah, blah, blah. She tells me the story about, what it's going to look like if they keep going the route that their doctor was recommending. And she says, I'm just curious, do you think you could help me with this? And so this is the first time this conversation comes up. But I said, well, let me tell you my story, and let's see. And we did have success. She was pregnant maybe 4 months later, and so yeah, it really opened up this whole interest for me in the connection between fertility and women's sexuality, and just connecting the dots between all these things that are both
Yeah.
systemic and personal. Yeah.
That's amazing. I'm just so like amazed at your premonition.
I know. Isn't it incredible? I mean, the subconscious is so fun. I mean, it's also
It is.
sometimes terrifying, but it can be really incredible.
Right.
Yeah.
It's so funny because I was having this conversation with my younger daughter because she had a
Uh-huh.
dream one time because I told her a couple of crazy things. We just had an earthquake close to Florida,
Yes.
as you may have heard,
I
which
did.
I was doing an earlier podcast and I felt it. I texted my husband because I thought he was awake in the other room. Is
Uh-huh.
there an earthquake? Because I was
Yeah.
like, what? I knew it was an earthquake. It had to
Something's
be.
happening.
And
Mm-hmm.
what's really interesting about this is that my daughter, my 11-year-old, this week said to me, are there earthquakes in Florida? And I said,
Wow.
no. And she goes, will there be? And I said, no, like there usually is. There never
Right.
have.
A
And I'm
completely
like, oh my God. So
reasonable
then I told
response.
her today, completely. So then I said to her, I said today
Oh,
when I picked her up, I go, well, guess what? I was like, you have a gift. And I'm like, I told her
yeah.
the story. She goes, yeah. And you remember my dream? She had a friend that had
Mm,
moved away to another
mm,
school. And then like maybe 5 months later, she just had a random dream about her that she was in class. And the next
mm.
day, that day, she woke up and she came back. So she had these things
Yeah.
happen and it's crazy. And so we were talking about it and I
Mm-hmm.
said,
Mm-hmm.
she does also have nightmares sometimes. So I say it doesn't always come true,
Uh-huh.
just so
Uh-huh.
she doesn't get freaked out. But it
Right.
does sometimes, but dreams are really fascinating. It's just
Mm-hmm.
so interesting. So that's interesting that you actually felt it, like you knew it, and your subconscious was trying to tell you by symbol
Mm-hmm. Yep.
that wow, it's pretty
And it
incredible.
was feeding me some of the content that needed to be worked through. Like these are the things that want to be detangled in order to have freedom around this. Like
Yeah.
this is another way of looking at what quote unquote cancer, is at this more subtle level. It's a really interesting lens to look through. Hmm.
It really is. And the fact that you were actually able to heal yourself is fascinating, I find,
Hmm.
without really having specific tools. It's like
Yeah,
your body was cueing you on exactly what you needed to
exactly.
do and you listened.
Exactly. I know I had none of the fancy stuff that I know now. I didn't know anything about nutrition. I didn't, like there's any number of practitioners that I work with when I'm on a holistic team, especially for fertility. Most of my clients will have, acupuncturists and naturopaths and, different body workers or something that, we're all working in tandem. And, I had no awareness of any of that. And yet, when the doctor came out of this biopsy, she just looked at me. She's like, I am very aggressive. I biopsy everything I see. I see nothing. I see
Mhm.
nothing but beautiful pink normal cells. And she just was like, it must
That's
have been
amazing.
it must have been a false positive. And I thought, nope. Like I know something happened. I don't know why, but
Yeah, that's
yeah.
incredible.
Hmm. Yeah.
Wow. Well, you had a dream about it to
Yeah.
confirm.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
That is
Hmm.
crazy. So,
Exactly.
so continue. I was
Mm.
so amazed by that I kind of took
Mm.
you off on a tangent.
Yeah, well, that's, it's fun to be in conversation and go with the flow. Yeah. Totally.
Got into it because you had a bunch of different people. It
Yeah.
kind of found you. It sounds like the
Yeah,
calling.
exactly. It did. It really did. It wasn't something I was going out looking for. It just, similar patterns kept showing up in many of the women that were coming to me. And, um, it was really striking. And so I really understood that, you know, some of these experiences that I'd had were really prepping me and showing me some of the content about the subconscious stuff, like some of the myths people have about their bodies and what it is to do work. I mean, it really, just kind of served a certain part of my offering up to me on a platter. So I knew like how it was that I could start to contribute. Yeah.
That's amazing. And then so you have a background in family therapy, in marriage and family therapy.
Right. So there's a whole branch off of counseling that is, in fact, today it's even almost more mainstream than it was, 20 years ago when I was exploring it. But there's a whole range of therapies that now acknowledge the body mind connection and how to, somatics is, a word that maybe people who are listening would recognize, like this recognition that like, it's not just about, insight anymore and talking through things. It's like, yeah, that does a certain something. And yet there's this whole body piece, that wants to be accessed. And sometimes it takes other tools in order to do that. So yeah, that's what I started to get really into.
And what type of tools do you give people when to access it? Because that is something that, in theory, it sounds amazing, and I know that I know that there's more than theory on this, but a lot of people can know that, but still not know how to access it.
Yeah, that's what I find to be the case in almost everybody, is that they there are some people that come to me not knowing for sure what all the content is, but there are plenty of people that come to me, they're like, I know I have anxiety. I know I have sexual trauma. I have a feeling that my stress from my job is impacting me. They kind of have a sense of that and they just don't know what to do. And, yeah, I mean, there's some of the tools that are more mainstream, like a lot of people have heard of EFT or tapping and EMDR, these things that sort of like reprogram things somatically. So I'm a modality geek. I have a whole big list that over the years I've learned, because I just like going to workshops, I guess, trainings, and and this is part of like being trauma informed as a practitioner. But it's different for different people. Once people are in the room, it's usually pretty clear what their body responds to. But yeah, it's about like, gosh, if I understand certain things intellectually, great, that's part of the process. But like how to get that message into, so it's like the soundtrack of the body, so it's just like running through your bones, that usually takes some of these other tools, of which I mentioned a few, but there are many more. Just people I usually don't hear of them, we just usually kind of experience them once we're in there. Yeah.
And I find that a lot of times the body expresses itself almost like a metaphor or like a reflection of a physical version of what is going on in the mind. Like I've seen sometimes people like have throat issues, like thyroid issues when they don't use their voice. And so what are some of the interesting things that you've noticed or stories of people displaying things like that? And then once it was resolved, like how did that impact them?
Yeah, well, of course, in the context of fertility, like there's a number of diagnoses that people are aware of. There's sometimes people come with unexplained infertility, but but I certainly worked with plenty of people with with PCOS, with different with different things happening with the endocrine system, autoimmune, which is goes hand in hand with endocrine functions. And yeah, like there's so autoimmune, for example, it's really typical for people to have patterns around fighting themselves or not trusting themselves or regularly overriding their boundaries, listening, hearing a yes, but insisting on a no, or vice versa, you know. Um, and
Right.
and as you begin to work at listening more carefully and, you know, paying attention to the body's rhythms, symptoms start to little by little soften and, you know, do a U-turn, right? So like that's just one example in terms of that, but you know, especially in the context of fertility more generally, it's really it's almost 100%. The content varies from person to person, but the themes are so often about safety. Even women that haven't experienced sexual trauma with a capital T, I mean, one in three women have, but many women don't know how to think about trauma. They think, oh, if I haven't had that kind of a trauma, then that's irrelevant to me. And often I find that once we kind of get in there, they actually have had an accumulation of what I call little T traumas, you know, around sexuality,
Mm-hmm.
around stuff with their partner, around body shame. You know, there's any number of contributors, again, systemically, you know, with some of the ideas we hear about the body and about women. And gosh, I mean, just the fact that, you know, as a woman, there's like this razor thin line of what's accepted in terms of sexual expression, you know, too much and and that's not okay, and too little and you're a prude, and you know, it's
Mm-hmm.
you know, there's
Yeah.
all these ways in which women are contracting and comparing and trying to figure out how to fit within a very narrow window of welcome, and that kind of
Yeah.
contraction.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah. It's a contraction that is a lived one, and it shows up in the body, you know, and it's almost always in some way or another in the mix, as far as I see. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing. And you speak about, because I know you give talks, you've spoken about common fertility myths that you often hear. Can you share a
Yeah.
few?
Sure, sure. Um, well, I'm sort of hinting at the first one, but I want to be more explicit. I'm glad you asked. And that is that,
Mhm.
you know, this whole fertility thing is not just a quote unquote medical thing. You know, like
Mhm.
the inner game is 100% important. You know, like it's absolutely important to feel hope and openness and receptivity and trusting in, you know, the world or the universe, belief that your body is wise and amazing, you know. And if people start to look at fertility as a purely physical thing, they're missing anywhere from 40 to 80% of what's really going on underneath the physical symptoms. And we've talked about some of those things. If your body is holding sexual trauma or lack of safety, being a woman, a lack of safety in terms of the idea of bringing a baby into this world because the universe is a hard place,
Right. Yeah.
right? Um, Past
Mhm.
regrets, you know, for prior quote unquote creations, you know, like a business that went south or a career that you're, you know, still in and miserable doing, you know, like if on subconscious body level, you don't trust your ability to create and have it be a good thing in your
Mhm.
life. Um, you know, there's all of that that impacts, you know, the capacity to be open and receptive, you know, and just to connect some dots, just even with this first, you know, myth, like an open body will have proper blood flow. It will be well oxygenated. There'll be good circulation, well distributed nourishment. And, you know, all of this makes for happy hormones, you know, but a body that's
Mhm.
running, you know, intense emotions and stress and guilt and a need to be driven, you know, like these things come hand in hand with inflammation and poor circulation and hormonal, you know, like dysregulation, you know. So that's really, I mean, like, there's a few more things I'd like to say, but like, I really want to like underscore and put a box around this, that,
Mm-hmm.
you can't think of the physical without looking at all the things that contribute to the physical, when you're trying to think about how
Yeah,
to
I
engage.
completely agree.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you see
Yeah,
this in
in
your work
everything,
too.
really.
Yeah. Hmm.
Absolutely. You know what I loved, what I always loved about Chinese medicine?
Yeah.
There's a couple of things I love. I love the fact that they go for the root and not
Hmm.
the symptom. They never treat the symptom, they treat the person.
Yes.
But what I love about it
Hmm.
is that they consider the human spirit,
Exactly.
and they consider the human spirit as being part
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
disease.
Hmm.
So a lot of times they say disease can start in the spirit, and
Hmm.
we treat the spirit. So sometimes just by figuring out an imbalance physically
Hmm.
in the meridians, you can actually alleviate anxiety, or people can start to sleep a little better. And it's
Yeah,
all the same. It's all part of a whole.
that's
So
right.
it's really that holistic, that
Yeah,
very similar as what you're talking about.
exactly.
And
Exactly.
it's just we're our work approaches it from different ends,
Yeah,
but it ends up affecting the whole.
exactly. Yeah. I sort of like, I don't mean to be flippant, but I like joke with people about like, if you're cleaning the garage, do you want your husband to start on that side and you start on this side and you work your way into the middle? Like that's sort of the
Right.
idea of a holistic approach. Like we're all, like doing different versions of some of the same things. And if,
Yeah.
when people have resources and access to multiple practitioners, I usually see them move through things with more ease, and it's more efficient. Yeah, and
I agree. I think I always say it takes a village.
hmm.
It really does, but you got to get like a lot of different holistic practitioners.
Hmm.
Sometimes,
Hmm.
you could do acupuncture, but guess what? Massage.
Yeah.
I also studied years ago Ayurveda. I don't do massage, but
Uh-huh.
massage is so soothing, and it's really
Yeah.
good for vata types, which is ether and air, and they
Hmm.
tend to feel a lot more grounded. And
Hmm.
so there's so many different aspects. And then there's nutrition,
Right.
where you can really get into the energy of food, and
Hmm.
it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, and there's two other things I want to say about myths, and again, like we're already sort of referencing some of them, and and I think maybe we'll talk about some of these a little bit more too. But one is that another myth is that some people kind of just like take for granted, like, well, stress, that's just how it is, and like that it's possible to like kind of power through stress is another,
Yeah.
like, well, when you're stressed, yeah, gosh, I mean, the body certainly engages fight or flight. And even if the stressor is a maxed out schedule and a disappointing moment with your partner, and it's not about a threatening predator hunting you in the wild, um, it's still important to recognize that a low grade, a chronic stress response, which many working adults in our culture have, because of just how we've set everything up. Um, there's something about like, well, if stress is normal, then it must be okay, and it's that is not true.
Right.
That is not
Yeah.
true.
I remember hearing a statement, and it's just so interesting. I don't remember who said it. It was either my cousin or something, that a human can even get used to poop,
Uh
to
huh.
living in
Uh
poop.
huh.
It's basically, it doesn't matter. You can get used, just because you're used to it
Yeah.
being there, doesn't mean that it's okay.
Right. Right. And speaking of being used to, sort of like these ideas of like what we start to accommodate, like it really also speaks to this other idea, and that is, people think it's better to avoid all that old stuff, past grief from pregnancy attempts or miscarriages or abortions, or trying to get on with things too soon without true resolution.
Mhm. Yeah.
People think if you can
Yeah.
avoid the old stuff, it's better. And like all of this impacts fertility. I definitely know that most of us would rather do anything than look at old icky trauma. But first of all, when
Mm-hmm.
you work with a professional that sort of employs some of these approaches, it doesn't have to feel like drudgery. It can feel refreshing to like feel some movement. Same thing with old
Mm-hmm.
childhood traumas. But the fact is these things are stored in the body, and as long as they're in there, it's going to add to the body's challenge around feeling safe and opening up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And as we know in Chinese medicine, stagnation, it's pretty much stagnation of emotion,
Mm-hmm.
stagnation of energy,
Mm-hmm.
and that causes disease because,
Mm-hmm.
anything that's stagnant isn't able to flow and
Yeah.
move the way it's supposed to. It deteriorates and it kind of like causes
Mm-hmm.
disease and hardening and
Mm-hmm.
no
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, exactly. The stress on many levels. Yeah. Ah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so definitely I believe, and I actually had spoken to Alice Domar. I've had her on
Mm-hmm.
here, and she has done a lot of research on stress and fertility and
Mm-hmm.
how working on my body can actually improve the chances of getting pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting too is that she said her goal really is not to get the patient pregnant, but get them well,
Mm.
which of course you don't want to continue living in torture.
Yeah.
So I thought that was such a profound thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
And you also mention healing one's own birth story, which I found fascinating.
Mm.
Can you share more about that?
Yeah. Well, so, this is something I actually learned from a friend of mine who was, years ago, was telling me about this idea in Chinese medicine, that during the time in utero, there are a lot of psychological foundations really being laid. And they are going to set up certain things that, set things up for a lifetime, for better or worse. And in the psychology field, what we believe, though, those three things, or there's many things, but they kind of come down to three. And one is, hopefully babies are having the experience in utero that I'm okay, I'm inherently good. Two, that I'm welcome here, I'm wanted, and that I'm safe.
Hmm.
And that these are sort of these
Hmm.
three core beliefs, that uh, that can be interrupted, even if they're true, even if I was wanted. Um, that if certain stressors are happening for mom at certain times, when this is what I'm developing in utero, then there's all these ways in which trauma can actually be pre-birth, actually. And and and
Hmm.
just real quick, I'll share, like, I mean, even in my own case, the first time I asked my own mom about my birth, I mean, she's just one of those, like, kind of cut and dry, she's like, oh, it was fine, went without a hitch. And I was like, oh,
You came
yeah,
out.
exactly. I was the third, and that was sort of her MO. By then, she's like, I was doing a load of laundry, my water broke, you were born, you know. and But as I asked more questions over time, as I thought about more subtleties to check in about, I learned that there was actually this incredibly intense story about my grandpa who had Alzheimer's, who he and my grandma were in town ostensibly to help, but she was in deep grief because it was the first time she was really seeing how much he had declined. And and so, like, all of that was actually much more in the mix than she was even aware of then, or since. And so, when there's all this intense stuff going on for mom, like, it impacts you. um, and then on top of it, we have a lot of stuff around birth itself in our culture, because we have these birth narratives in kind of the global north, especially around hospital births and fear and wheelchairs and doctors and pain stories, I
Hmm.
call them. Like, people are not afraid to
Yeah.
share with you their trauma stories about
Mm-hmm.
what happened then and how hard it was. And uh, there's there's a lot of ways in which birth is still being handled in hospitals in ways that are not evidence based even. And and so, like from a psychological
Right.
perspective, we recognize that, like, oh my gosh, all these stressors that mom went through, um, pre-birth, birth, during the first trimester, like all of this gets stimulated as, as I start to think about, becoming a mom, certain things that kind of are just laying there, sort of latent or dormant, come alive sometimes. And so knowing
Mm-hmm.
your own birth story, and doing work around uh, any traumas, any stressors that you have a sense mom felt is often, really helpful in your own process. It's kind of like about unfreezing an aspect of
Yeah, I
yourself that is
agree.
stuck.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, it really does make a huge difference. I mean, I know that my mom had like her own stressors at the time,
Hmm.
and I remember one time being pregnant with my first and being really upset.
Yeah.
Just something happened that I got really upset, and I was like really sensitive, and somebody said something that really hurt my feelings, and
Hmm.
I remember feeling really upset, and as I was crying I felt like the baby just squirming around in there,
Hmm.
and I was like, ooh,
Hmm.
like this really, it kind of took me back, and I was like, I got to be careful
Hmm.
with how much I allow
Hmm.
myself to get emotional or upset.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah, so
exactly.
that was firsthand. I can like literally
Yeah, you felt
feel
that on
it.
the other side. Absolutely. Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. So you also talk about recognizing deep subconscious patterns or blocks
Hmm.
to conceiving.
Hmm.
It's something I actually notice. I notice it when people come in, and a lot of times they'll have, I guess, trauma, but it's, a perception of their moms being like either weak or dominant,
Hmm.
with a dominant husband,
Yes.
their father being really dominant and the mom being really weak and not really going to work, just being a stay-at-home mom. And their perception is like, I don't want to be like that when I get
Hmm.
older. And there's this rejection of that. And they'll come out and admit it. They know exactly, just like you said before, they know exactly what's going on,
Hmm.
and they know exactly what's happening in their minds,
Hmm.
but they don't know how to, like I mentioned, access
Yeah.
it.
How do I do something different
So
if I
it's
can
kind of
tell that this is the
interesting.
template, Yeah, there's
Yeah.
definitely there's common fears, like what will happen to us as partners, once we become parents. Will we be
Mm-hmm.
okay? Can we handle the stress? It's definitely a place where old family stuff comes in, because even if dad is Mr. Fantastic, and you have a sense logically he's, going to be amazingly supportive and present, if you do have a story from your childhood
Mm-hmm.
that your mom had to do it all and your dad was absent, then there's some part of the brain that's just
Mm-hmm.
like, tapped into that. And it's like, and the thinking brain doesn't win. The emotional kind of like, critter brain is what wins. So
I like that.
yeah, it's like, even when you have an intellectual sense of what's true, you have to also work at the level of those deeper, um, more challenging fears. And so yeah, relationship stuff, partner stuff. We kind of already talked about sexuality. Like, these are places to check in about. There's a few other areas that can come up for people in terms of subconscious stuff. So like, even if you're doing the fertility diet and getting acupuncture, and you have the most sensitive, competent reproductive endocrinologist around, one of the things that I see a
Mm-hmm.
lot of is women running a lot of masculine energy in their lives. Like, I think we have
Mm-hmm.
to run a lot of masculine energy in order to be successful. Like that part of me I was describing in my original story about myself, like logical, brainy, linear thinking, go, 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 push, 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 make things
Mm-hmm.
happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like this works
Right.
well.
And you know what? That gets rewarded.
Yes.
It gets rewarded at the workplace, it gets
Yes.
rewarded at school. And what happens when you get rewarded? You continue that behavior because you want the reward.
It's
Usually people use behaviors because they get something
Yeah,
from it.
it's reinforced left and right, and it's in some ways important in
Hmm.
terms of being successful career-wise and so on. But fertility is all about the feminine and all about the
Hmm.
creative and the soft and the mysterious and the nonlinear and so on.
Hmm.
And many
That's right.
women try to get fertile in a very masculine way because that's all they know, and it's kind of swimming
Right.
upstream a bit. Some will make it, but it's really hard in that way. And so what I see in those couples is a pattern of
Hmm.
stress and strain and fear that even if they do get pregnant, goes on into
Hmm.
pregnancy and on into parenthood. And, so like this thing about masculine energy, like is another place where it's really confusing for women to like go like, well, how do I change that? Because we're talking about huge cultural systemic,
Yeah.
you know, pieces here. And, it does take support to figure out how to integrate the things that work well in your career with the parts of you that you want to open up to. You don't want to keep cutting off, like how to integrate the both of them rather than see it as sort of zero sum either or.
Right. It's really moving from doing to
Yeah.
being, which I think that is very challenging
Hmm.
because our initial reaction because of our conditioning is to
Hmm.
do. We got to do. What do I have to
Hmm.
do?
Yeah.
What's the next thing to
Right.
do? And it's not about
Yeah.
doing. It's about being and becoming the egg,
Yeah.
becoming that receptive, open
Right. Right.
energy.
And self nurturance is really hard when you're in that space and when there's no permission and no time and it's tough to eat
Hmm.
right and you're trying to be in control of
Yeah.
everything and,
Hmm.
trying to do your meditations and
Yes.
visualizations and put sex on the calendar. It's
Yep.
not anybody's
Yep.
fault,
Yep.
but these are the challenges. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
Definitely.
Mhm.
And it's the world we live in, so it's kind of hard
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
be a Buddha
Right?
when we got to pay the bills and
Right? Really? I mean,
and
yeah.
we have a lot of
Mhm.
distractions everywhere, so
Yeah.
it definitely
Mhm.
is a lot more challenging in our modern day world than it
Yes.
would have been like maybe in the past when we didn't have as many distractions and
Right.
we can sit
Which is
under the
which is
stars
why
and
those
moonlight and just
statistics are spiking, I think. It's more of a commentary
yeah.
about our society than any of these individual couples. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
good point.
Mhm.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
So, are there any tips that you'd like to share?
Well, I've offered a lot of tips around where to poke around and dig. And so what I think I'd like to say, I want to offer at least a couple things you can do to help you process whatever you find, because I certainly don't want
Mhm.
this information to send people into even more overwhelm and trauma. The idea is to give you suggestions so people can be more empowered. And so one of the things is to really be mindful of your stress as you begin to look around at what might be going on under the surface, and bring a lot of self compassion and a lot of breath. At a very tactical level, like a breath practice or a meditation practice, even if it's 1 minute a day. Just to
Mhm.
help people if they start to get in what I call kind of the red zone, like stress wise, like on a scale of 1 to 10, 7, 8,
Yeah.
9, 10, something like that is the red zone. And, like you want to do this in a way that feels manageable. Um, in what, and bring in whatever supports you can so that it can be manageable. Otherwise people start judging themselves for their challenges, and God, that's so painful and
Oh, yeah, that's a
counterproductive.
cycle. That is so bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and we've all been there.
Yeah.
That's why I had such a reaction just now because I've been there, and you know
Yeah.
what that does? It keeps you trapped in that cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. And so track your stress, bring in breath, bring in self-compassion, while you're journaling, while you're doing, while you're going to yoga, and so on. But like at least, do some of this personal work with whether it's with your journal and a few well-resourced friends, like if you feel like you have some spaciousness with this process, fantastic. If your timing is more urgent, do some of this personal work with a practitioner if you at all can. But really, it's like, if you're gonna kind of dig around in the subconscious, you want to do it in a resourced way, supporting yourself or getting
Mhm.
support, so that, yeah, it's really important to me that we kind of start to work with that. This is another social program that a lot of people have running, like no pain, no gain. And if it's not hard, it's not worth it. And it's like, no,
Mhm. Yeah.
does not, healing is not designed to be hard. If it's hard, then
Yeah.
something's off. And I just want people to, that's my tip. I bring in whatever resources internally and externally you can.
Yeah, that's a great tip. It's, it's something that a lot of us do. We have these programs that we have to fight, and, there's no growth unless you have like really, really
Mhm.
bad
Mhm.
experiences and to get
Right.
through it. And
Right.
yeah, if you can, if you do have challenges, that's, there's many truths. So of course we can get through things and overcome things
Mhm.
100%, but that's not for sure. I agree with you.
Yeah.
That's not the only way.
Yeah.
And it's important also to have support
Yes.
and people who are not going to say really insensitive things.
Right.
That happens
Oh,
a lot, to
totally.
have a safe space.
Or like if somebody's like, "Well, my husband is frayed," and, at the end of his rope, it's like, "Okay, then find somebody else to be with you rather than, keep trying to get water out of an empty bucket," just for your both of your sakes.
Yeah.
Like looking for the
Yeah.
resources that you have access to, relationally and otherwise.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
Awesome. Great words, and very interesting topic. I'm very big on the mind and body. I really
Mm.
do believe that
Thank you.
it's incredibly powerful.
Mhm.
And I think we're just scratching the surface with understanding it
Mhm.
from a research perspective
Mhm.
and from studies.
Mhm.
Well, they are getting there. I mean, there's some pretty
Mhm.
interesting
Yeah.
studies on how visualizations can
Mhm.
make such a difference. And but it's very I think the biggest thing is, like you said, just becoming mindful
Yeah. Mhm.
and paying attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if people were to want to find you,
Mhm.
do you also offer consultations,
Mhm.
like outside of the state, like online?
Yeah, I do. I don't do as much one-on-one these days, but for those that are listening and have an intuitive hit that this kind of work is what they need, like, yeah, feel free to reach out to me, and I do offer free consults. Otherwise, what I think I want to point people towards is I have a very inexpensive 12-week online course that I actually designed it as like an part of the 3-month package that individual clients would get when they signed up with me. That's how I used to kind of set things up.
Mhm.
And because it seems like everyone seems to sort of need the same basic things in terms of detangling
Mhm.
sexuality or motherhood double binds, or, some of these things we've talked about. So the program's really designed to give like sort of like these key practices that improve the success rates of IVF and other ARTs, and just fertility, if people are going a more natural route, because it focuses on these sort of subconscious, core level healings, supporting the reproductive system, shifting the basic beliefs that keep your body in fear or constriction, and so on. So yeah, so for people that want to check that out, if you're listening and this kind of has something for you, they can go to www.aufertility.com, and there's a whole page there that kind of gives more details about what they'll learn in the different weeks. Um, but that's the way to connect with me, either for the course, or there's also a way on there that people can reach out to me and email and see about a consult if they want one-on-one. That I do that when people are well matched with kind of what I offer. So those are sort of the two ways to to learn more for those that are interested.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Mm-hmm.
This is really fascinating topic, and
My
I'm
pleasure.
sure
Thanks for having
you'll
me.
probably get a lot of visitors. And by the way, I will be putting your website on the episode notes.
Awesome.
So if anybody's interested and didn't totally get it from the audio, you can go ahead and look on the episode notes of this podcast episode.
Thank you.
So thank you so much,
Thanks,
Mary,
Michelle.
for coming on.
Appreciate it.
It's been a great
Yeah, I
conversation.
loved talking to you. I love the work that you're up to as well. I appreciate it all so much. Thank you.
So that concludes today's episode. You can find all the links mentioned on the episode notes. If you're enjoying these episodes, please take a moment to leave a review. Reviews are everything to podcasters. You can find me on my website at www.thewholesomelotus.com. And please be on the lookout for my online course and program. This course has emerged from everything that I've been using for the fertility program I now offer at my office. I wanted to consolidate all of my suggestions and coaching and put it into a form that anyone can purchase and use. It was important for me to encompass key fertility health factors as well as guide you in implementing changes in your routine that are shown to boost fertility while being realistic and user-friendly. I will be offering this course with and without coaching. If you're interested and want updates as well as a free ebook on my top 10 fertility boosting habits, you can visit my fertility page on www.thewholesomelotus.com, where you can find the subscription form. I thank you so much for listening in and hope you have a beautiful day.